So this is an example poster you could do for the PSY170 poster session. In this case, I decided to look at taxi drivers because this often pops up on the top 10 lists of worst jobs. I saw this on several lists. And we'll get into some of the reasons why that is. But taxi drivers, this is a job that entails, of course, driving around a taxi or an automobile to transport people around a city or a district. So, of course, knowledge-wise, you have to know, of course, how to drive safety, as well as directions to major locations in the area, tourist stuff, and then just knowing all the road safety laws and taxi cab regulations. Skills-wise, you have to be proficient in using maps, including online maps like Google Maps. You need to be proficient using cashier software, and really important to have good listening and communication skills so you can interact well with customers, and able to recognize and report automobile problems, such as engine problems or flat tires, things like that. Under abilities, you need to be able to follow verbal instructions from customers and telling you where to go. And a big important part is being dependable, reliable, responsible. So showing up on time, making sure that you're responsible for your passengers in your vehicle. And one of the reasons why this job often ends up on the worst jobs list is that it's very stressful. So you need to be able to handle stress and handle difficult customers. As we'll get into, taxi cab drivers are often much more the targets of abuse by customers than other jobs. You also need to be able to be a good driver, so have quick reflexes, a good reaction time, and able to lift heavy objects like luggage. Now, another reason why this job tends to be on the worst list is that it doesn't pay very well. So these individuals get paid just a little bit beyond minimum wage at $11.30 per hour on average, and make a median salary annually of $23,510. Now, as for employment, according to 2014 numbers, which were our latest numbers, there are a lot of jobs in this sector, about 234,000 jobs, and there's projected to be a healthy amount of growth, somewhere around 10 to 12% or so, up through the next few years. Now, one of the problems I wanted to address in this industry is traffic accidents, because taxi drivers typically are in at least a few accidents over their careers. Now, one thing that I felt kind of encouraged about is that taxi cab drivers actually have fewer crashes per miles driven than non-taxi cab drivers. So the stereotype of the taxi cab driver being really unsafe and speeding and driving dangerously is pretty much a myth. Now, per 1 million miles, they found that taxi cab drivers were at about 2 fewer accidents, but per accident, there were more injuries. So, in fact, among all the injuries, 71% that involved taxi cabs involved an injury compared to 41% on average for non-taxi cab drivers. Now, one of the biggest reasons why this is the case, they believe, or scientists believe, is that taxi cab passengers, so people who use taxis, are far less likely to use a seatbelt than passengers in an average car. So one of the biggest things that we can do to increase fewer accidents, or sort of decrease accidents per accident, is just to get people to use their seatbelt. So there's been a lot of research in what kind of persuasion tactics people can use in order to change behavior. And one that I thought was applicable in this case was a study by Goldstein, Cialdini, and Griskevicius, that's how you pronounce it, in 2008. But their task was to help hotels save water by getting customers to reuse towels. And they had a few different conditions. They had the standard condition, which is an injunctive norm telling people what they should do. And this amounted to basically, help us save the environment, please reuse towels. So that was the control condition. In this case, only about 35% of people actually reuse towels. But when they used a descriptive norm describing what people do, and in this case, they said that 75% of our guests reuse towels, this actually increased towel reusage by about 9%, up to 44%. Then another condition to get even more specific to the people viewing the sign, they said 75% of the guests in room X, whichever room the sign was placed in, but these guests reused towels. This increased another 5%. So if you can convince people that there's a norm of reusing towels, then people will be more likely to live up to that norm because people want to fit in, they don't want to be ostracized or be seen as different. So borrowing some language from these kinds of studies, I made a sign that can be viewed by passengers in taxi cabs. And it says, join the people of whatever the city's name is in reducing taxi cab injuries. And it says, studies show passengers are less likely to get into an accident in a taxi cab than other cars. And I wanted to put that in there so people aren't worried or bolstering their stereotype that riding in a taxi is dangerous. But then it goes on, but accidents do sometimes happen. And you can greatly prevent accident injuries by wearing a seatbelt. 80% of taxicab passengers in city name wear seatbelts. So there's the descriptive norm right there. So it says, please join us in preventing taxicab injuries. So of course the goal is to get more passengers to wear a seatbelt to reduce these injury rates. Another problem that I was actually kind of shocked by is the amount of taxicab drivers that are the targets of really bad behavior on the part of their customers, even to the point of being threatened, assaulted, robbed, and even murdered. One thing that shocked me was that taxicab drivers are 4 times more likely to be murdered on the job than police officers, and far more likely to be the targets of homicide or threats than the average worker. One study by Schuer, Metzga, and Grun-Rehom in 2010 found that all of these types of cases of threat and assault and robbery amounted to about $20 billion in costs per year in the taxicab industry. So this is a huge problem. Now, one potential solution, and one that's used by a lot of private ride-sharing services like Uber and Lyft, is to have customers identify themselves when they're hailing cabs. And one way to do this is to create an app where customers create a login that uses their real name. And if the taxi cab services is tied with city or state records, their identification can also be aligned with things like criminal records for this person, which are public knowledge in most cases in most states. So if there's a customer who has a history of violent crimes, they can be identified and flagged for taxi drivers who might pick them up. Or if a passenger has ever threatened, assaulted, or robbed a taxi driver in the past, they can also be flagged. And of course, if they ever mistreat taxi drivers in an illegal way, they can then easily be reported to the police and even banned from future taxi services. Now, one potential problem with this is that there's been some evidence that when people rate customers on services like Uber and Lyft, that minority members receive more negative ratings even if they're not displaying more negative behavior. So especially when ratings are subjective, biases can sort of creep in. One way to avoid this is to have taxi drivers only be able to report behaviors that are specifically threatening, or indicative of assault or robbery, things that are illegal. That way, they're much more objective measures and they wouldn't negatively target or be biased against minority members. And so I sort of just drew up an example here of a customer warning that might come up if a customer, John Doe, has a history of using profanity or drunken disorderly behavior or even threatening drivers, what that might look like. And then it's up to the driver's discretion whether to pick this customer up or not. Or especially if they've become a real problem, they might even get banned from the app entirely. So this is just a little bit of review of how to present a poster like this for the PSY170 poster presentation.